Now that we've got the pen turned, let's talk sanding. This is the sandpaper that I like to use. The brand is Wood River, and I believe that is the house brand at Woodcraft. Where you get your paper is not important. What is important is the different grits you use. I recommend using grits 150, 240, 320, 400, and 600 in that order to sand your pen blank. Now what I do, you notice that I use the roll paper. As I take the paper off the roll and tear it, there's nothing on the back of the paper, it's blank. I like to take a Sharpie and I like to cut off a little piece of 150, 240, 320, each different grit, and I go ahead with the Sharpie and I label the back of it and lay it on my table. That way I can just reach down, grab it, go from grit to grit, and I don't have to worry about getting the wrong grit and going up a grit instead of down a grit. So I highly recommend the Sharpie method on the paper. We're going to start out with 150 grit. One thing we want to do as we're sanding our pen, you don't want to hold it in one area too long because you don't want to create grooves in that particular section of the pen. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure we turn this pen at about 1500 RPMs. We want to turn our lathe down as low as it will go. The lowest that my lathe will go is about 500 RPMs. So I'm going to basically turn my lathe down to 500 RPMs and I'm going to begin sanding. And what you really want to watch for is I got really close between the bushing and the wood, which is what I want. I should not have to do a lot of sanding because my pen is very smooth. But you want to make sure you don't get down and dig in these areas right around these bushings and get below the bushing, because then when you assemble your pen, you're going to have a little catch there that your finger is going to feel every time you use that pen. So watch real carefully where the pen meets the bushing and make sure you don't go below that. So let's do a little sanding. Basically, I just like to keep the paper moving. The slower speed of the lathe will give the paper time to clear the sawdust so that I don't have to worry about the paper clogging as much as it would if I was running at a higher speed. And you can already feel the difference, just how smooth that blank is getting. Another tip, when you're sanding, I like to sand from the bottom. That way if the paper gets ripped out of my hand, it goes this way. But what I've seen people do is when they sand from the bottom, they'll push up and put a lot of pressure. You shouldn't have to put a lot of pressure on this mandrel. That can bend your mandrel, so avoid using too much pressure. Get as close as you can with your tools so that there's not a whole lot of work that you have to do with the paper. I'm just using my fingers underneath just to sort of put slight pressure on the blank, nothing major. All right, looking pretty good. What I'm doing now is I've shut the lathe off and I'm searching the blank looking for any gouges that might have occurred with the sandpaper, any imperfections or issues. I don't see any, but I am going to take my paper, and while the mandrel or while the lathe is off, I'm going to sand crossways like this. Now this is hard to do. I'm left-handed, so I generally use my hand over here to turn because you can't. At the end of the mandrel, I got the mandrel saver, so it's a little harder to turn. But I'm going to sorry about the shaking of the video too, but I'm just basically going to sand back and forth. So if there are any grooves that were formed by the sandpaper, I'm going to remove those before I move on to my next grit of paper. Don't have to use a lot of pressure here, just a nice back and forth motion. And I'm going to take one more look at the blank, and wow, it's looking beautiful. Okay, I'm going to jump up to my 240, and I know what that is because I can simply look at my paper and see 240. Let's get the lathe back on. This shouldn't take long. Okay, once again, take any grooves out that I might have. I keep noticing a shadow, and I just realized I'm wearing my baseball cap. Sorry about that. I've got one groove there that I'm trying to work out. It must have come from the 150 paper. And I'm just polishing it out. Okay, I really like that. It's looking good. Let's grab the 320. 320. Get the lathe back on. It's highly unusual for me to sand a pen like this and not have some type of air filtration on. I normally run a shop vac to suck up the dust. I got this pen pretty smooth, so I'm not doing a whole lot of sanding on it, but I don't really like to breathe the dust from the pens, so I highly recommend having some type of air filtration going, be it a shop vac or a dust collection system, whatever you might have. All right. This is going to be a beautiful pen. Alrighty, let's jump up to our 400 grit paper. Okay, 400. This thing feels like glass. It just gets so smooth it feels like a piece of glass. And I right now cannot see with my eye any scratches in this blank whatsoever. It is just looking beautiful. It's going to make one nice pen. All right, that feels great. Let's jump up to the 600, the final paper. Okay. All right, we're getting nice and close here. Take a quick peek, see if we notice any blemishes or gouges. And that pen just looks absolutely beautiful. I don't see anything wrong with that. All right, one last thing I want to point out. I'm not going to use this particular paper on this pen, but there's a micro mesh kit, and I don't know whether the camera is going to show it upside down or right side up, so I'll flip it both ways. And what this is, excuse me, this is some polishing paper, and it's about 9 different grits of paper. It comes with a pad, a sponge pad. You can use this on your pen to take it down to a 12,000 grit. I don't generally do that on wood. I reserve this for acrylic, because acrylic you've really got to get the scratches out because every scratch will show. But I just wanted to show this paper and this particular kit. There are all types of these. There are some that are screen mesh. There are buffing pads. But if you really are working on a piece of wood that you want to just make that just beautiful, beautiful shine, you can polish it with polishing paper. This is kind of expensive. This kit's probably about 50 bucks. So I don't recommend buying that. 600 is going to give you an incredible finish on your pens, and 90% of what you do, 600 is going to be sufficient. Okay, I paused that video there for a second, and I did something that you guys didn't see, and I wanted to point that out. You'll notice the dust has been cleaned off the lathe and from below the lathe. Before you start polishing your blank, you want to clean up all of the dust and chips, because if any of those get on one of your rags, transfer to your blank, they can mar your blank up. So take your shop vac real quick, clean up all the dust before you start polishing. The next thing you need to do is clean the dust up on the blank. And what I do is I like to use a little bit of denatured alcohol. And once again, I'm not sure which way this video will appear, so I'll flip it both ways. You can pick this up at any of your, excuse me, your big box stores for a couple of bucks. It's not real expensive. I like to take a paper towel and I cut it into strips, and I'll kind of fold those strips over a little bit, get a little bit of denatured alcohol on there, turn on my lathe, and just basically rub the denatured alcohol all over the blank. Then I'll go to the dry spot, and I like to dry it a little bit, but you really don't have to because this stuff will evaporate so quickly. And you can see it evaporating already. It's already starting to clear up. And what you've done is you've taken all of the dust off of your blank. Okay, make sure that's closed. Now, when I first started making pens, didn't want to spend a whole lot of money, so I started using beeswax. And basically at this point, I would have just gone in and I would have put beeswax all over the both halves of the pen, and then I would have polished that off with a paper towel. Do not use a rag like an old t-shirt or anything like that. Don't be tempted to do that. Stick with paper towels, because if that paper towel or that rag happens to get caught on the lathe, if you're holding a rag in your hand, it's going to pull that rag into the lathe. If you're holding a paper towel, it's going to tear, and your hand's still going to be sitting here, and the paper towel is going to be gone, and you're not going to hurt yourself. The beeswax did great at first. It gives a nice finish. It's not a very long-lasting finish. So I graduated from beeswax, and Carl Jacobson uses a little crystal clear paste wax with a little mineral oil. And I started mixing that up. And he sands with that, but it's also his final finish. And that looked really nice, gave a nice finish, but it just, once again, it really didn't have a long-lasting effect that I was looking for on a pen, something that's handled day in and day out. To put that on a vase or a bowl, it looks pretty darn good, but if you're going to use this, you need something that's going to stand up. So the next stop for me was Hut Crystal Coat. Now, if you're a new pen turner, this is where I recommend you start. This is not real expensive. It's a few bucks. I get it at Penn State. I think you can get it at Woodcraft. It's readily available. And the Hut waxes. Okay, oops. I recommend starting here. This is going to give you a nice, beautiful finish on your pen. The Hut waxes, you're going to use the brown first. It's kind of a polishing wax. They'll tend to fill any little gaps and level the pen, and they'll put a nice protective coat on the pen so that it can be handled daily. And the pens do hold up very well with the Hut wax and the crystal coat. But I have gone one step farther. I wanted to have a brilliant finish that would last for a long time. So I graduate it to the Triple E Shine wax. And what this does is if you sand to a 600 grit and apply this Triple E wax, it's like getting like a 1200 grit sanding. It does a wonderful job. I will say one thing about it. Do not leave this out on your bench. If this gets warm, it will melt and separate. I keep mine in a refrigerator and I pull it out shortly before I need it so that I can use it. Otherwise, once it separates, you may as well throw it away, and it's very expensive, so you don't want to let that happen. After I've applied the Triple E Shine, I like to use the Shella Wax. And just a drop of this puts a coating on the pin, a shellac coating that is going to last and last and last. So if you give a pin to someone, a year from now it's going to look as good as it did when you handed it to them. The pin kit that we're using, I've said a couple times, is called the Classic. And the Classic requires you put a tenon on this end of the pin for this trim ring. And so you cut a little tenon in there, you slide this trim ring on, and glue it on. I have found after making these pins enough that I prefer to finish the pin first, then cut the tenon and put the trim ring on. I have better luck doing that for the sake of the video, because I want to show you guys exactly how it's done. I'm going to go ahead and cut the tenon now and then polish the pin. And the reason why I usually prefer not to do that is I don't like to get the wax and stuff where the tenon is, because the glue doesn't hold up as well. But I'm going to show you guys a little tool. This is a deal. You guys have probably heard of Captain Eddie if you're into watching lathes. This is a 10mm wrench. I picked this up at a garage sale for 25 cents. You can see the end of the wrench has been ground off. Basically take it to your grinder, grind it off. This produces a 10mm tenon tool. I took a set of calipers and I measured the inside of this ring, and it was exactly 10 millimeters. So I picked up a bunch of these wrenches at a garage sale for $1 a piece. I found one that was a 10mm wrench. I ground the tip off, and let me show you how well this thing works. All you've got to do is put it on your tool rest, and I'm going to back that tool rest out a little bit. There we go. Basically, you'll lay it on your tool rest, you'll push it into the pin, and you'll lift up so that the bottom lip presses against the bottom of the pin. It doesn't have to press hard, just a little bit. And as it's pressing, you push in, and this particular, the top part that I've ground off, will cut into the wood and produce a perfect 10mm tenon every single time. Now there's two things we have to do before we cut the tenon. Number one, I like to lay the ring up here and make a little mark where the tenon's going to be. Now don't push it all the way on. You don't want it to come up short. I push it on and then I back it off just a little bit so you can see there's about a, not quite an 1/8 of an inch gap there. And I'm going to put a little mark right here. I'm going to turn my lathe on low speed, and I'm going to, okay, there we go. I got my mark. That's where my tenon's going to be. Now a little trick with this, and this is part of the pin kit, I'm going to relieve my tailstock and pull it back. I'm going to pull these spacers off, and I'm going to pull the front half of the pin off. They tell you this, and keep the pin pointing the proper direction with the front bushing up. This is the center. They tell you this in the kit. You take this bushing off, and notice how it's different size? If you flip it over, this tells you exactly the size you want your bushing to be, which is 10 millimeters. Now, you can cut that by hand, which is how I did it the first couple of times until I saw Captain Eddie's video, and now I go ahead and flip it around and use my tenon tool. Let me lock my tailstock back down. I'm going to turn this on, speed it up to, I'm between about 1400 RPMs. Remember, I'm pressing up and pressing in. Take your time. And it'll finally go right onto the pin. And that's when you know you have a perfect 10mm tenon. Now what I'm going to do is take my sandpaper and just lightly run back over this, because when I did that, I kind of chewed a little bit of the end up. I wasn't as careful as I should have been. I'm going to start out with about some 320. Actually, let me get my tool rest out of the way so there's no damage to my fingers. But I'm going to go with some 320. I'm just going to lightly sand that just to basically take the roughness off. Now I'll run through the 400 and now the 600. There we go. And all I wanted to do was clean that up. Now that I've done that, I'm going to end up having to hit it with my denatured alcohol. Let me blow that dust away. Get my denatured alcohol back out. I'm going to clean the pin again. I should have cut the tenon before I cleaned it the first time, but got ahead of myself. All right. Now we're going to let that spin for a second and let the denatured alcohol dry. Okay, once again I did a little behind the scenes thing. I popped the video off and vacuumed up the dust that I made from creating the tenon. I just got a little bit ahead of myself there. Should have created the tenon first. I'm going to go ahead and flip. Actually, I'm going to take this off and I'm going to show you how well that tenon tool worked. Now this slides right on, and it's just it won't fall off. There's just enough wood there to hold it on, and I've got a beautiful fit right up against the wood, and all I need to do is glue that on and it's going to fit beautifully. One drop of CA glue and we've got it. So let's pull the cap off, put the pin back on here, and let's get to finishing. I've got my pin cleaned, it's dried, the lathe's cleaned, all the dust is gone, the chips. I'm ready to start applying some of this Triple E wax to polish up my blank. So I'm going to turn the lathe on, and I guess I'm going to run about 1200 RPMs or so. Get a little bit of wax. Just start applying it to the blank. I can feel the heat. You can see the black is actually coming off the bushings where it's polishing the bushings, but I can feel the heat from the friction as I hold the wax, or the rag with the wax on it, up against the wood. I'm trying to be real careful not to get any down here on this front part where the tenon is, because I want to be able to glue with super glue the chrome ring onto the wood, and the wax will keep that from happening. I just keep changing to a clean part of the paper and just keep buffing and buffing and buffing. When that piece of paper gets dirty, get another piece. And you can see that gave a nice rich color, natural color of the pecan, but a nice rich color to the blank. I'm going to apply a little bit to the front half. Just pressing a little bit, not a lot of pressure, but just a little bit of upward pressure, and you'll feel some heat in your fingertips. You don't want to press so hard that you burn yourself or anything, but you want to give it some pressure to let the polish get in there and work against the wood and do its job of polishing any scratches out of that wood and really bringing out the luster in the wood. And there's nothing on the rag. That's when I know I'm done. I continue to polish and roll the rag over until I get no residue from the blank on the rag. And you can see we have a beautiful, beautiful looking blank here. I've got my Shello Wax, and I've been shaking it up to make sure it's nice and mixed. I'm going to just basically pop the cap off, fire the lathe up, and we're just going to put a drop on the paper. Doesn't take a lot, and we're going to spread it around on the blank, trying to get the best coverage that we can. Once again, you're putting a little bit of pressure on the blank with your fingers. Not a lot. Like I said, you don't want to burn yourself, but you want to build up a little bit of friction to let that polish do its job. And, ooh, that's getting warm. Form a nice hard shell on that pen. Okay. I'm going to flip this over. Get another drop on here. Go to the front half of the pen. I like to hold it on there with the wax, or I'm sorry, with the polish, until I feel the heat. And then once I feel the heat, I'll generally roll to a clean piece of paper and just do a little buffing. Looks beautiful. What I usually do is at this point, I'll let this set for a few minutes, sort of set up, and then I'll come back and I'll put a second coat of the Shello Wax on it, and then we'll get to assembling the pen. Okay, I let about 5 minutes elapse, and I'm going to go ahead and put a second coat of the Shello Wax on this blank. Once again, I let it heat up, and then I flipped over to some clean paper, and I'm just buffing. And you can see the shine really starting to come in. Okay, let's get the front half. Make sure you get plenty of good coverage. When you first put it on there, I like to get the entire blank wet with the wax as best as I can before I start pressing against it to build up the heat. I just want to spread as much of the polish over the blank as possible. All right, and that is absolutely beautiful. Next step in this process is we need to assemble our pen. So I'm going to take a minute, get some things ready, and then I'll be back to finish the last piece of the video. Okay, what we've got here, I've brought the pen kit over and I've laid the pen kit out. Each pen kit will come with instructions to tell you how to assemble it, so don't worry about that. I brought the blank over and I just basically kept it together. You don't have to do this. The main thing is you keep track of where the front is versus the middle versus the end, because your bushings being different sizes, they're going to mate up to the pieces of the pen and make a nice smooth fit. This tool you're looking at here is a pen press. What this is used for is we'll take the wooden blank and the pieces of the pen and press them together. Now, this pen press is a tool that is a very nice to have. Not a must-have. I see a lot of people who use pistol grip clamps. They work fairly well. I've also seen some people who use a bench clamp to do this, a wooden bench clamp. And I've seen a few people, there's a new device that Penn State has that I think they're about $11, but they're Teflon bushings that go on the front the headstock and the tailstock of your lathe, and you can actually use your lathe to twist the pin and press it together. Now the way things work, that this pin press has a nice Teflon piece up front to keep you from marring up your pin. The back has this little aluminum block. I always worry about that marring up my pin, so I just take and cut a piece of corrugated cardboard that I can just slip right in there to use as a little bit of a cushion. I'm going to loosen this up, spread it open. I'm going to grab the front part of this pin, just pull the bushings out. And the first thing we'll do is we'll press the nib of the pin into the pin. So I'm going to tighten down, bring the handle forward just a little bit. I'm going to slide the cardboard in there. And I like to hold it right here in the middle as I press the pin together, just to make sure that it goes straight. Now I had this a little far apart, so I'm going to adjust it back a tiny bit. And of course, I dropped the cardboard. Who hadn't seen that played out before? All right. And I guess I should probably tighten it down. There we go. All right. Sorry about that, folks. There we go. And we have a beautiful fit right up next to that chrome ring. Okay. Next thing we want to do, we've got the transmission for this pin. And the transmission screws off with this little ferrule here. And we're going to press this little ferrule into the pin. So we're going to get our pin back on the pin press. I'm going to adjust it out just a tiny bit. Grab my piece of cardboard. And just make sure it goes in smooth. Alright, let me tighten her up a little bit. I'm having all kinds of trouble with not having everything as tight as I need. There we go. And I've got a beautiful fit there. You can't feel any difference between the chrome and the wood. Next thing we'll do, we'll slide the spring onto the ink refill. I believe that's a standard Parker refill. We'll slide it into the pin. Okay. Take the transmission. We'll tighten the transmission down. And now the front part of our pin is ready to go. For the back part of the pin, okay, this little bushing here actually can come out. It unscrews. Okay, let me get this tightened up a little bit. Since I'm going metal to metal, I'm not as worried about the cardboard. There we go. And I also want to make sure that I get that metal ferrule flat against the wood, so I prefer not to use the cardboard as a cushion because I want that as flat as possible. Now, I really like that marking there, so I'm going to take this to the other side and find an area that is not as attractive. It's all beautiful, but I want the really grain and the markings in the wood to show. And I'm just going to tighten the cap on. And there we have the cap of our pin. Okay, I'm going to get the bushings out of the way too. Got my chrome ring here. What I like to do is take a little bit of super glue. I like to put a dot of super glue on the wood. Maybe a small dot on each side, not a big dot. And then as I put this on, I like to turn it as I put it on to smear the glue. Press it up on the pin. And you'll give it a few minutes to dry. So let's just lay it there, cap our glue off. We're going to let that dry for a couple of minutes and we'll come back and final assemble the pin. Okay, a couple of minutes have passed. The super glue should be sufficiently dry. I always like to wait before I put the pin together, just in case any of that super glue squishes out around here. I don't want to glue the pin together. Need to be able to take it apart to change the refill. What I'm going to do now is, we had a line on our pin, a perpendicular line, to allow us to line the grain up. So what I'm doing is just looking for the grain, and I believe that's where it is. So I'm going to, with There we go. Slide the pin together. And voila. We have a pen. Beautiful pen. I hope everybody's enjoyed the video. And if there's any questions I can answer, any way I can help you, let me know. But thank you for watching. Thank you for your valuable time. And I hope this video helps you turn your first pen.